Webinar, and we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex. I'm with the Scholar, and as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Thank you for tuning in this evening as we welcome Reuben Jonathan Miller and Elizabeth Hinton. We have a really important discussion this evening for you. We're happy you're here, so thank you for tuning in. Thank you for supporting the bookstore, and we hope you enjoy the program. But at this time, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers here this evening. Our interviewer this evening is Elizabeth Hinton. Elizabeth is Associate Professor in the Department of History in the Department of African American Studies at Yale. Hinton's research focuses on the persistence of poverty, racial inequality, and urban violence in the 20th century United States. She is considered one of the nation's leading experts on criminalization and policing, and she is the author of From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. I have to plug her new book, which I just received today, which is coming out this May. This is just an advanced copy. It is called America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. We, the Midtown Scholar Bookstore and Haymarket Press, will be co-hosting the launch event for this book this May, and we will have signed copies available. So make sure to pre-order the book through the Midtown Scholar. You'll get a signed copy, and I'll share the link to that in the chat room in just a moment. Our featured author this evening is, of course, Reuben Jonathan Miller. Reuben is a sociologist, criminologist, and social worker who teaches at the University of Chicago in the School of Social Service Administration, where he studies and writes about race, democracy, and the social life of the city. He has been a member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, a fellow at the New America Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, and a visiting scholar at the University of Texas at Austin and Dartmouth College. A native son of Chicago, he lives with his wife and children on the city's south side. Of course, Reuben's new book that we are here for this evening is titled Halfway Home. Here it is, Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration. I've got to read just one blurb. This one's from Matthew Desmond that I really enjoyed. It said, quote, "This persuasive and essential work weaves together moral philosophy, in-depth interviews, legal theory, and personal history, reckoning with the meaning of justice and redemption in an unjust society," end quote. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes before we get started. First, we love audience questions. So if you have a question at any point for our speakers, please use the Q&A button. It's towards the bottom of the screen here. Click on that, submit your question. We love questions from the audience. We want to hear from you, so ask away, and we'll try to get to as many as possible towards the end of the program. And lastly, if you enjoy the talk and want to support the bookstore, there's a very easy way you can do that, and that is to purchase a copy of the book. Here it is once more. Every purchase helps support our staff, this event series, and the author. So I'm going to drop a purchase link in the chat room for the book. Click on that. It will take you to our website where you can grab a copy of the book. And once again, thank you everyone for tuning in and for your continued support. But without further ado, Reuben Jonathan Miller and Elizabeth Hinton.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that introduction, and to Midtown Scholar for hosting with Haymarket. It is such an honor for me to be in conversation with Reuben Jonathan Miller this evening. As Reuben knows, I have been a fan of his work for quite some time and egerly anticipated this book. And now that it's finally arrived and I got to read it, I just am beyond moved. And, just getting to hear Reuben speak and just be in conversation with him is always a privilege. But this really got me thinking about things in new ways, and a topic that I'd like to think that I know something about, both in my research and also firsthand through the experiences of my friends and family who have been incarcerated and are incarcerated. So I guess I want to jump in by talking about you, Reuben. I mean, so often we talk about the forces that lead people to prison, like why people end up in prison. And very seldom do we talk about why people don't go to prison. And as you write, despite your privileges, like working at elite institutions that you talk about, having a stable home life and breaking into the middle class, you quote, "We're born poor and Black in the age of mass incarceration. And as such, you write that prison follows me." So, through the book, you talk about your father being incarcerated, your brothers, and many of your friends. And you were arrested at 14 for graffiti bombing in a train yard, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question is, what do you think kept you out of prison? Was it luck? Was it something else?
Mm-hmm.
Why did you have a different fate than your brother?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think luck, some of it really dumb luck because, kids are kids, and I got in fights like everybody else. I got into, I drank with my guys, outside when I should have been going to class like everybody else. I joined the gang like everybody else. I had trouble in school, certainly high school, like everybody else I grew up with. And so a lot of it was luck, and a lot of it was the deep levels of support that I received from people, adults outside of my family system. I write very briefly about a bike that got stolen from me. It's just a line, but a bike got stolen. But Brother French bought me that bike, and Brother French was a brother from the local church, and he bought me my first bike. And so it's moments like that. It's a pastor who put me on his shoulders and threw footballs with me. I'm not a big sports guy, but there were these exchanges of love between adults and me coming up. And despite that, I still found my way into trouble, but I didn't find myself into the depths of trouble. The second thing, so there's luck, that's part of it. But then the second thing is just really the arbitrary nature of arrest, incarceration, adjudication, these sorts of things. So the police will come, but don't always arrest everybody, or everybody will get arrested, but charges don't always stick. Sometimes you beat a case. I wasn't in that kind of situation, but a million people who I spent time with were, and sometimes people don't even look. So if I think about some of the more less joyful things, so we started off our conversation today on a really joyful note, with you expressing some admiration for me, which just touched me deeply because I have deep admiration for you and your work, and it's just powerful and important. And then moving into these things allowing me to think about people who love me and care for me, especially my grandmother who made us read a book a week and give a book report and lip sync Michael Jackson. But my brother was doing all the same things. But when it comes, but then there's the arbitrary nature of the way the thing works. And when I think about that, I think about the time my family, this isn't in the book, our car was stolen, and we asked the police officers who came, like, yo, aren't you gonna dust for fingerprints? Like, we don't do that. And then I think about things way more egregious, like the 17,000 untested rape kits in most major cities in the country, the 17% clearance rate for murders in the city of Chicago that improved to something like 30 or 35% or something like that. And so, the over policing, under policing shows up in these rather random's the wrong word, it's certainly targeted, but quite arbitrary ways, quite variegated ways that result in different kinds of consequences for different people.
I want to talk some about your process in writing this book, because a tremendous amount of research went into this book, and yet, I mean, you write it like it was easy and it's so seamless. But I mean, it is. I mean, the book is beautifully written.
Thank you.
And you spent more than a decade following women and men in and out of prison. First between 2008 and 2013, I believe, in halfway houses in Chicago, right? And then Detroit reentry study that you started doing when you came to Michigan in 2014. That was when I met you, because I also happened to be at Michigan at that time. So can you tell us a little bit about this decades-long process that went into writing this book? And I'd love to hear too about how your ideas about the project changed from, when you started in the early 2000s to today. And how did you decide which stories to tell? Because there are a few really key figures that kind of ground the reader throughout.
Well, as you mentioned, the 3.5 years that I spent in halfway houses was following a question about, how people come to change their lives, and how people attempt to do that, and how people experience a kind of social welfare policy regime that requires it of them. So this is during that time I was on the tracks of what rehabilitation was, and the transformation of prisoner rehabilitation. And what I found was that rehabilitation had left the prison. So there was all this discussion about the death of rehabilitation, which I don't think is wrong. But rehabilitation changed forms. It turned into something we call reentry programs, which really are animated by the way people think about poverty development, which is always about building the skills of individuals to help them overcome the obstacles that they face. And so the current instantiation of that, or the way that it shows up in the world, is through social services, prisoner reentry programs, and these places are beautiful in that they relieve real human suffering in real time, and they're run largely, not always, but largely by wonderful people. One of the places that I got to spend time with was run by an Episcopal priest when it started. He had died decades before, who was working in the jails and just decided that people needed a place to stay. So he just brought them home and let them sleep on his floor. And from that, this beautiful ministry sort of emerged. And so there are these loving relationships, these relations of care that I was very interested in understanding, that go into this idea of rehabilitation, which is about people changing their behaviors, changing how they feel about the world. And so that required me to spend time with people trying to do that. And so I spent about 3.5 years in halfway houses in Chicago. But the thing that I learned, and Chicago is my home city, it's where I went to college and school, and where I made family and all this stuff. It's like Chicago was home and is now again. But it was interesting. I learned a lot about people and their institutional lives. What it meant for them to be in a setting like that. But I didn't know much about how they lived out any of the stuff that they learned on the inside of a halfway house. What happened when they left the church basement? Who did they, all these lessons that they learned, of which I have a critique, of course, because that's, that's what we do. We think about things, we think about the problems, we think about the threads that run through, especially how you think and treat largely Black people in this country. And there's this highly individualizing, blaming narrative, that thread that runs through the way we think about criminal justice policy in the United States, and certainly expresses itself through the reentry program. But anyway, but I didn't know much about how they lived out their reentry, as it were. So when I got to Michigan, I had the opportunity to learn about what home life was like. Mm-hmm. And so I followed men and women, 60 men and 30 women who got released from a detention center and a reentry house, a reentry program in Detroit. And there hadn't been any work done on detention centers, really. Detention centers, by that I mean police station lockup facilities, places where someone's held very temporarily while they're waiting to be arraigned. And so there's very little work on that, but that's the place where a lot of the action happens. So, infamously, where people commit suicide, where folks get hurt, where people get hurt anyway. So I'm in these spaces, and then I got to follow people from their release from that place home. And then from there, I got a fellowship to spend some time in Princeton, which was up the street from New York City. And I clicked at that point, meeting a mutual friend of ours, Ronald Simpson Bay, who's a beautiful brother, and who shows up quite often in the book, to a national network of formerly incarcerated activists. And I began following them around because I want to know, okay, so I understand a little bit about what happens when you go home, and I understand a bit about what happens when you're trying to change. But I'm curious about what you do to change the structures that you keep bouncing off of, the laws and policies that we've implemented, the things we put in place that I think got you into this situation to begin with. What's the strategy? So I start following folks on their campaigns, to close Rikers or implement services even in some of these cities, or to allow formerly incarcerated women to sit on juries, these kinds of things. And the stories that I learned over this time are the stories that I start telling that show up in the book. So I didn't know that the book was going to be 3 studies. That wasn't my plan. I did 3 studies, and I wanted to write about this question. And these stories express to me not just what happens so often for so many people. They were representative of themes that I would see over and over again. So, there's some science to it, of course. But they were, what I hope came across was the power of these folks' lives, and there was something about connections to others, something about the decisions that people were making, something about the radical power of their agency and the radical power of the institutions and organizational arrangements, the laws and policies that prevent them from enacting their sense of agency. And these stories sort of represented that clash for me. And that's why I wrote about them.
Let's talk about some of those stories and some of your findings. So you argue that the problem of mass incarceration is ultimately a problem of citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually in this sense, like this book is about the new Jim Crow. Like the new Jim Crow really, I think, refers to the kind of the civic status that people with criminal convictions in the United States have. It, like that is akin to, when you're released from prison, right? A civic status with denial of certain rights, similar to Black people living under the segregationist regime in the South. Many of my friends and family who have convictions, who have returned, talk about like, I'm still like they're out of prison, but they're still not free. They're not quite free yet. So can you talk to us some about what the challenges and obstacles are that people face when they return home from prison, and the ways in which mass incarceration is a problem of citizenship in that respect?
Yeah, no, I appreciate this question quite a bit. For me, citizenship is rules, it's responsibilities, it's rights. So the things that you must do, they're like voting or paying your taxes. There are things that you're protected from and that you're able to do, accessing life, liberty, and happiness. Is sort of the abstract way I think we think about it. Rules. The things that govern how we relate to one another. There's laws that prevent us, for example, from harming others, or prevent others from harming us and allowing us to flourish. And people with criminal records just have different rules. They have to follow laws that no one else has to follow. For example, there are 45,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target people with criminal records. These lock people out of the political economy and culture. I mean, whole categories of employment that people with records just don't have access to, that everyone else has access to.
You said 45,000. Let's just make sure everybody heard 45,000 laws that target people who are formerly incarcerated.
45,000 laws, but the devil's in the empirical details. If you pick a state, so for example, in New York, there's over 1,000. In Michigan, when we were spending time there, while we were there together, there were 789. Since there's been some reforms there right now, about 611 or so rules, regulations, policy, sanctions still on the books. And this is after a series of expungement laws and radical reforms, I think, fairly radical reforms on the state level. Chicago, Illinois, my home state, has 1,400. It outpaces them both. In most states, something like 29 or 30, if you have a criminal record, you can't sit on a jury. So now what does it mean when it's time to judge whether or not, you can't hold most public offices. People on violence registries can't be in the same home with a foster child, or they can't adopt a child themselves. So the way that family is regulated in very interesting ways. But then there are rules on top of rules. There's a sheet of paper that you get handed when you walk out of a prison called the conditions of your release. And these things not only tell you what you can't do. For example, you can't do the bedrock of American democracy, which is gathered together in groups. You cannot associate with known offenders. Association is the bedrock of the democratic project. So it not only tells you what you cannot do, it tells you what you must do. Something that we can't make anybody else do. You must report the drug treatment. You must piss in a cup. You must show up for this appointment with your probation officer by 3 p.m. each day. If you miss any of these things, so 45,000 formally codified rules, regulations, and sanctions in the criminal code and in state statutes that aren't necessarily even the criminal code, but they show up there. Then rules on top of rules, this sheet of paper that you have to do that differ by state, that differ by city. So you can never know if you're in violation of a law from place to place or time to time. It's really quite wild. And then if you violate any of those things, you can be sent back to prison to serve out the balance of your probation or parole. So 25% of all convictions in a given year are for reasons like this. You missed an appointment, you didn't report to a workforce treatment program, you were drunk when you showed up to probation the next day, you smoked some weed even though it's illegal, you were in a house with dogs, you got your hands on a firearm, Second Amendment rights, by the way, like all these things that don't target anyone else are formally different for you. And this is why I talk about, this is why I talk about this is a problem at the level of citizenship, because citizenship at the end of the day is about belonging. It's about being a part of a political community, a human community, and being able to move within it, and your ability to do so is guaranteed through your citizenship. But formerly incarcerated people with criminal records, in fact, people who are simply accused of a crime. These are people who are routed into, in and through something that looks like probation through bond court, for example, through, while they're waiting on their sentences to be heard, electronic monitors, shackling them to their neighborhoods, even being accused of a crime suspends your rights to citizenship, and I think ushers you into not second-class citizenship, because it's not a constitutional contradiction. The 13th and 14th Amendment both have due process clauses, as famously in 13th Amendment made famous by the 13th, the documentary, of course. They have due process clauses which say it's constitutional to do this. I think it's not a constitutional contradiction, and therefore not second-class citizenship. I think it's an alternate kind of citizenship, an alternate form, and I think we have to reckon with that if we're gonna crack this egg.
Yeah, I think too, the other part of it, and that belonging has to do with the way that you can relate to like other people if you have a conviction. So, a friend of mine talks about when he was on probation, he saw a woman get beaten, and he felt like he couldn't stop to intervene. He didn't know what to do, because if he stopped to intervene, that might run into issues with his probation.
That's
right. And it's like, at that moment, he felt like he couldn't, like he was unable to just respond in a human way to what he was seeing, because it could get him back in prison.
So this is exactly the book. This is exactly the book. It is the fundamental transformation of mundane routine relationships, and it is also the fundamental transformation of even our most intimate relationships. So other things that come with having a felony record is almost a broad ban on people with felony records from living in public housing, and the ability, for example, for landlords and employers of all kinds to say, no, I will not hire you. 19,000 employment regulations on the books in this country, whole categories of employment. So you can't, it's hard to find a place to stay. It's nearly impossible to get a job. Now that you've got the job, let's say you finally get one, are you going to complain when the boss abuses you? How are you going to interact? How are you going to resolve? What happens if the guy who always steals the orange juice out of the refrigerator continues to steal? What you going to say? It fundamentally changes how you operate in and across what we might call the life-giving institutions of a free society. It changes family. It changes the labor. It changes your civic engagement and how you engage civically.
Yeah, the other piece of that your book really helped me understand in a new way, or think about, and I don't think it's been captured this way before, but how you talk about like the favor economy that is necessary for people when they return, so that like in order to survive, you're constantly having to ask people for favors. That's right. And that's, I think that's one component of what you call a carceral citizenship. Like everything is reliant on other people. I won't get too much into that, because read the book and it's amazing. But I do want to pick up on the issue of family, because I think that's one really important before life, afterlife of incarceration that we don't connect or see as much, and that your book really, really illuminates. You really show the toll that incarceration takes on families, and not just, of course, on incarcerated people, but the way that family members are also doing time in many ways with their loved ones. And that, is in part the product of the fact that about half of incarcerated people are parents.
That's
And
right.
that nearly 3 million children in the United States right now have a parent who's in prison. So can you talk about just fully the way that like the afterlife and incarceration itself plays out in within families and in communities?
It's interesting. A big part of the book, and I don't know if you were going to ask this question later, and you may. My brother was incarcerated, and was in and out of jails and prisons while I was writing the book. And we can. I'm sure that'll come up at some point. But one of the things that was a trip while he was in was his reliance on me, what he needed. So why did he need me? So what did he need? He needed food. He needed food because the prisons don't serve people enough to eat. And he was hungry. And he's, I'm 6'2", like 220 or something like that. He's 5'11", somewhere, like 190, something like that. So, we're not like little guys, it's like, he's not a little guy. And he's in prison with a bunch of guys. All of them aren't little guys. And even if they were little guys, they're all grown. And they all need to eat, and the prison doesn't serve enough to eat. And there are all these lawsuits that come out from prisoners who are filing class actions for things like food, maggots in the food spoiling. There's a whole literature on food being used as punishment inside prisons. Anyway, the point I'm trying to raise is that they don't get enough to eat. What they get to eat isn't nutritious enough to sustain them for the day. So then what happens? Well, he needs eat. He needs honey buns. He needs ramen noodles. He needs soups, is what they call them. Well, who provides the soups? Who provides the honey buns? Who provides the ramen noodles? The family does that. So the family feeds the prisoner, And in some places, and I understand anyway, in some places, the prisoner may get a bill for their time incarcerated. Well, who pays the bill for the time that they spend on the inside? Okay, so the prison doesn't provide food, clothes, and shelter. Though it has taken them in as wards of the state, it is impossible for them to provide for themselves. The family have to, therefore, bear the burden of the provision. Well, the prisoner also needs to have communication with the family. We know that the literature, the penological literature, tells us that the more communication, the more smoothly the prison runs. And so this is why they allow phones inside prisons. It's not because it's some humanitarian deed. It's because it helps. It's in the, quote, penological interests of wardens across the country and prison administrators across the country to allow for things like contact with families. It also would be cruel and unusual punishment. It's also unconstitutional. But anyway, here's the point. Phones aren't free. When my brother was in, it was on average $6.55 per phone call. We lived in an age of cell phones. Right, and not minutes. Right, like this is right. So that's not free. So families bear the brunt of that. Overdrafting their accounts on average, well over $250 a month. So says reports from the Ella Baker Center and other places. So the family takes on the brunt of the cost of the actual incarceration of the loved one. Who buys the boots? Who buys the socks? Who buys the underwear, which costs twice as much as it costs in the commissary as it should cost in the free world? I could get everything that my brother asked me to help him purchase at Marshall's or Target. The quality would be better, and it would be half to a quarter the price. But we absorb, that's the financial cost. Now let's talk about the emotional cost of imprisonment. What does it mean for a son or a daughter to have a man in a cage or a woman in a cage raising them 15 minutes at a time through collect calls? Now, I would see beautiful things. I'd meet with these sons and these daughters, these children, these lovers, and they will get the letter, and they will be buoyed by that letter because they knew there's a man in a cage who loves me. There's a woman in a cage who loves me. She loves me despite that cage. She loves me beyond that cage. She loves me through those bars. That's beautiful. But what does it take to maintain contact 5 hours from the house, 6 hours from the house? And who pays the emotional burden of all that absence? The families. Then they get out. 45,000 laws and policies, 19,000 of which say you can't have a place to stay, 1,000 of which say you can't have a place to live. 35 in Illinois, 35 specific rules on that bar you from accessing housing in the state of Illinois. Similar in New York, similar in LA, similar, like multiply that across the country. So who cares for the formerly incarcerated person? The grandmother, the girlfriend, he's sleeping on the couch. If he's got a drug conviction, up until recently, many states wouldn't allow him or her, even if she had children, to access welfare benefits. So who feeds them? All this burden. Now that I'm housing you, feeding you, caring for you, driving hours and hours and hours to see you, just to get turned around from time to time. That's going to happen 2 or 3 times over the course, because my dress might not be long enough, because I might not know that the prison's on lockdown today, because that's quite arbitrary, by the way. Because I might have come on the wrong day. I might have made a mistake because I sassed the guard. All these people with all this control over you, all these things, all this arbitrary stuff, all this burden that you're bearing as someone who loves somebody who's locked away. Now they're home and they can't take care of themselves because we've locked them out of the political economy. Now, here's the transformation. Here's the afterlife. That's the afterlife for sure. That's the material relation. We've identified it. You can't feed yourself. You can't house yourself. You can't make phone calls. But now let's talk about the afterlife in a different way. Let's talk about the fundamental transformation of these relationships. My brother sleeping on my couch. Mm-hmm. What does that do to our relationship when we have an argument? Then the landlord has a legal right to evict me, and does, because he can be sued if somebody breaks a law on his premises. This is also a part of the afterlife. Thousands of evictions each year because people with criminal records are put out simply because of their record. And public housing law says that I can be evicted if I so much as let my brother visit my home. Now I'm taking this great risk. I'm putting my neck out for you. I'm letting you sleep on my couch. My children need to watch cartoons. We need to sit on that couch and eat cereal and watch cartoons like everybody else. But there you are asleep because you're depressed. You know, what kind of strain does that put? Now you don't listen to me when I say, why don't you look for another job? And now you don't want to listen to me because I'm your little brother. Who am I talking to you? You used to scrap with me when I get whooped by these bigger kids. Now I'm telling you, you need to get a job. I'm telling you what you need to do as a man. It fundamentally shifts the nature of the relationship, you know? And so this is how it shows up, both formally, law and policy, and also informally.
Reuben, thank you so much for sharing that. This is incredible. And it's only just a taste of the power that is in this book. I have tons more questions for you, but I am gonna bring in some audience questions, which are coming in fast. And the first one is actually one that's along the lines of something that I wanted to ask you. And it's from John. He says, a lot of the reforms that were discussed in the House of Representatives after George Floyd seem to focus on reforming criminal justice procedures. This is obviously important, but it misses a lot of things. Could Congress pass a law that bars or restricts what companies can ask about criminal records on job applications? Is there any talk of such a policy reform now that Trump is gone? What are your hopes for reforms from Washington? And I would add, like, if you had a half an hour meeting with President Biden, mm-hmm. What are the policies that you would say along those lines of John's prompts?
I would ask President Biden to look carefully at the rules around expungement and what happens to people after they've been expunged, after their records have been expunged or sealed. I think this is one very practical thing. I think that expungement releases people from the control of these 45,000 laws. They still have to explain that record, what'd you do for the last 25 years, whatever the situation is. But at least you're not under the formal sort of legal regulation. As far as my hopes about checking boxes. Ban the boxes was an important movement, is an important movement. I think it does important work. I think we have to be careful. There's some literature that shows that when in places where they enact ban the box legislation at the city level, specifically, this comes out of Michigan. Sonia Starr and those folks have been talking about this for a few years now, that Black people get discriminated against in the labor market. And basically, like Black unemployment increases in those places because of the presumption, the conflation of Blackness with criminality. I mean, this is a striking conflation too, the conflation of Blackness with criminality as it relates to criminal records, because we know that while Black people are 5 times more likely to go to prison, to be incarcerated than their white counterparts, we still have an incredibly large population of poor white people in American jails and prisons. 800,000-900,000 white folks in American jails and prisons. 40% of the prison is white. That's underrepresented, but still one of the largest populations of people in the modern world. So what we've done to Black people in this country, we've done to American people more broadly. Like it's not national incarceration to stop the threshold of the Black family. What I'm saying is the egregious racism that we see in response to presumptions of criminality, the thought that Black people might be criminal is striking, and that's something that we have to tackle head on. And I think there's certainly law. There's a legislative move that can happen. I think ban the box is important, but I also think we have to do the important work of changing how we think about this problem to begin with.
That's so true. I mean, and I think that's in many ways what the kind of direction of the racial justice movement has moved towards, especially with, no matter what you think about it, but the idea of defunding the police, like changing the sets of investments that we're currently making that we know haven't kept our community safer or provided people with basic needs, as your book really makes clear. Okay, so we have a question from David, which is near and dear to my heart. He says, fascinating discussion. He says, Professor Miller makes the compelling case that when someone is released from prison, they are still encumbered by the legal system and thus are not finished paying their debt to society. Has it ever been true that when people leave prison, they were truly free? If so, when and why did the system become so punitive? That's like the question for historians.
It's a fantastic question. So I very briefly locate this moment in the 1970s with the Credit Reporting Act. And what happens is you see the emergence of the beginnings of criminal record databases that correspond with credit reports. And so that I'm talking about in its current form, like that is that's an important moment, something important to think about. The tracking of these records, the use of data and how we use it, what data, how data travels, this kind of thing. This is an important moment. But were people free when they got out of jail or prison? I don't think so. I don't think so because of the informal uptake of the disdain for people that we've criminalized, and the conflation of Blackness with criminality, which happens at the moment of colonial encounter. I think in the 15th century, I think from the moment that the Portuguese come into contact with Black people on the continent, there's a homogenizing of them. So there's a flattening of Blackness becomes a flat thing. It is not a flat thing. It's a glorious thing it's got moving parts and variation and interest, obviously. If we look at any Black people, any groups of Black people in our country, of course, but Black people get flattened. They get made into this homogenous, lawless, shiftless, godless entity. We create out of whole cloth Black people, and we conflate their lawlessness, their nakedness, and their difference with crime, with fear. We conflate their revolt from their revolt, their resistance to capture, with violence. We call them a violent people. We say, hey, look, they're resisting the barracoon. or the jails where we hold slaves, they are a violent people. Hey, look, they're revolting on the ship. They are a violent, they're revolting capture, right? They're revolting becoming slaves. They are a violent people. Hey, look, they won't let us round them up and throw them on a ship. They are a violent people. Anyway, this conflation of blackness with criminality, this conflation of blackness with violence, this conflation of blackness and fear is the enemy that we have to. That's the dragon we have to slay now.
You have such a great discussion too of those dynamics in the book, and listening to you talk now just makes me think so much about my own work and my book coming out. Like this idea that like anytime Black people resist, it's always seen as criminal, which is one of the big what I talk about in terms of the way that so-called riots are framed and why riots itself is so infused with this idea of Black criminality, which is part of the reason why I call this political violence rebellion. We have a question from Gabrielle. So going back to your earlier point about the kind of impact of mass incarceration and family and the connection between incarceration and food, Gabrielle asks, what possibilities do you see for on-the-ground organizing to alleviate the cost of families? Such an important question. How has the state sabotaged the ability for communities to support incarcerated people? I'm thinking about things like the Black Panther Party Free Commissary for Prisoners program.
Well, one way that states, and states, states big S, the state, and also states little s, like states like Illinois, Michigan, California. One way our governing structures get in the way of this is through the contracting of private companies to provide services, and the suspension of the ability for people to, for example, send in goods into prisons, and they do this under the framework of under a kind of public safety framework. So to eliminate, for example, to reduce contraband, you can't send. I couldn't send my brother shoes or something like that. To eliminate contraband, I couldn't go to Marshall's and buy shoes. What would be lovely is to be able to get with my neighbors and say, hey, my brother's locked up. They'd be like, yeah, my brother's locked up too. Let's start a shoe fund. Right? Like this is the kind of thing, this sort of mutual aid that communities do, that community organizers do so well. But the thing that gets in the way is the contracting of private companies. And so what happens, there's an interesting move that I think does some harm. So when people talk about prison privatization, they talk typically about private prisons, and then that gets dismissed because only 8 or 9% of prisons are private, and then the privatization discussion stops. But privatization is so much deeper than just, of course, as you likely know. But the privatization, I'm sorry, the person who raised the question, the privatization discussion is so much deeper. The privatization happens because Aramark is the company that provides prison food. Privatization happens because service providers who run risk assessment, who design risk assessment instruments are the ones who come in to determine which services, who give tests to determine which services the prisoners need. It's a private company that provides all the goods and services in the prison. It's Michigan packages or access secure pack that I used to pay $85 every quarter to be able to suspend commissary rules and send my brother an additional $85 worth of stuff every quarter for whatever reason, because this is what they just allowed. Hey, you want to spend $85 extra, spend it with us. But the only way to get him ramen noodles, I couldn't gather ramen noodles together. I had to pay for them either through the commissary by sending him money directly, or I had to through what another private company that held, quote, trust funds, or I had to order the noodles myself through Michigan packages. So the encroachment of private service providers and the specter of safety, the threat of contraband, these kinds of things get in the way of the sort of mutual aid that we're talking about. Having said that, organizers putting pressure on prisons because of the quality of food has done a ton. It's done a ton. Aramark lost its contract, for example, in Michigan a few years ago. But like these efforts really do matter. And so I think we can push to get to a place where where we can do things like this. We can engage in practices of mutual aid. But we have to undo some of the structuring that's happened through the business, as it were, of punishment. Uh-oh, am I frozen?
Hey, Reuben, I think we just lost Elizabeth. Hold on.
Oh no.
You back? Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
Listen to this back.
I apologize for that. So you can still hear me, although I lost some of the questions in the chat. But there was a really good question. I unfortunately don't have the person's name in front of me, but I'll paraphrase it, which was about basically like, what can we do to actually stem the tide of incarceration and begin a process of decarceration? You know, what are some of the things that what are the takeaways from the book? You know, we've talked some about the big policy changes that should be made. But what else can we do, even those of us who aren't connected to somebody in prison, to actually help address some of the issues that you've illuminated so very clearly and powerfully?
Thank you for that question. I think a couple things. So you know, we have political power, and I think what we need to do, well, so here's the big takeaway from the book is that there's no 5-point policy plan. You know, it's in the book. The big takeaway is that what we need to do is think about belonging and work hard to create a world in which people belong. We have political power. We live in a representative democracy. However you feel about how it works, you know, this is the system that we have. So one thing we can do is we can pressure people who we elect to enact the kinds of laws and policies that make it so that people belong, so that people have a place in the world. I know that feels a little bit abstract, but here's an example. So I put out this book in hopes that people would start paying attention to what I think is a fairly hidden social world that we've constructed right outside of our homes, inside of our homes, et cetera, that folks go through. Each one of those things has a tangible, each one of the, for example, the 45,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions. We don't need 45,000, obviously. This is a tangible thing. You can pull this, you can look at which laws are on the books in your state through the National Inventory of the Collateral Consequences of a Criminal Conviction. If you put in collateral consequences of a criminal conviction database in Google, the National Inventory will pop up. You can look at it and see what's what. You can pressure your congressperson about these things, about these laws, these policies, et cetera. I think a lot of action, though, if you want to decarcerate American jails and prisons, I think you have to do two things. You know, thing one is stop arresting so many people for actions, for the kinds of things that we arrest them for. So it's the spigot. You have to cut off the spigot, and the spigot lies with policing, with prosecutors, and it also on some level lies with calling the police. I'm not saying you should not call the police. This is not my position. I'm not telling you if you feel like you need some protection, you need to call somebody. You know, I'm not telling you the police is the right or wrong response. That's not my point exactly. My point is the things that we call the police for, the things that we arrest people for, the things we prosecute people for. That's the front end. Then there's this kind of middle ground, which is the sentencing. So changes in sentencing laws. And so pushing criminal justice reform efforts beyond the tinkering that we've been doing for so many years, especially as it relates to people who've committed acts of violence. People who committed acts of violence, that's over half the prison. Half the prison is there, half the people in prison are convicted for crimes of violence. But 90% of the criminal justice reforms, I'm not exaggerating, but it's not exactly 90%. But most criminal justice reforms address nonviolent, non-serious, non-sexual offenses, and so on the policy technical side of things, you want your Congress people and you want your advocates, the criminal justice reform advocates, to tackle head on the problem of violence, which will require some real accountability on behalf of people who've committed acts of violence. So figuring out what that accountability looks like, figuring out what appropriate, if you're not an abolitionist, abolitionists believe, get rid of jails and prisons. And I think, but the more important question for abolitionists that they raise for us to think about, if you're not an abolitionist, or if you are, is, what does the world look like without a jail or a prison? That's a very important exercise. So an abolitionist may not want to look at sentencing, but I think we need to look at sentencing. What sentences should happen in response to a crime? What punishments are reasonable, if punishment is reasonable at all? So this is the middle ground. People to deal seriously with problems of crime, of problems of violence, not just nonviolent offenses. And then on the back end, the question is the social context in which people return to, and that is a context in which they are highly regulated. I talk about this as a supervised society, and it's both formal and informal. So we have to change that. Okay, so those are specific things that you can put your political representative, advocacy, community organizing on, and get around these three areas, these three very specific things. But what is equally important is to push the discourse beyond the discourse, to push our thinking around and about people who've done us harm, who've caused harm. There's a story in the book of Brother Ronald Simpson Bay. He's a beautiful brother. I kind of don't want to give his story short shrift, but his son is murdered. He's in prison for a wrongful conviction. His son is murdered. And he advocates for his son's murderer not to be tried as an adult. He doesn't do this because he loves the murderer of his child. It's not because it's a feel-good story. They're not traveling the world. They're not on the circuit doing lectures together. They're not eating pizza together. That's not what they're doing. He advocates for this child because he believes that all children deserve a place in the world. He believes that all people deserve a place in the world. He does this from the place of an ethical commitment, not a feeling, not from a place of fear, not because it's cheap, not because it doesn't cost him anything. He does not hate this child. I would not blame him if he hated this child. Why wouldn't he hate this child? But even if he hated this child, he believes it's the right thing for a child to have a place in the world. This is the level of commitment we have to take to each other, that we have to allow for each other, a commitment to each other, that we will make a world in which there is a place for you. Like that to me is the big takeaway, of the book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you talk about, and you admit, you say, I know this might sound Pollyannish, but we really got to change hearts and minds. And I think, it's just become, I think, especially in this past year, just really clear that if we want to realize these meaningful changes, and this is the collective project, like all of us here in this room, we obviously are here because we care about these issues. And it's up to us to educate ourselves about them as much as we can and change hearts and minds. There's a problem within the American worldview right now. I mean, there has been for some time.
That's
and we've got to collectively undo this history and create a different kind of future that is more equitable and just. Okay, so we have time for one more question, and that question was from Art. I'm sorry I didn't give you proper credit, Art, because of my computer issues, but this is from Richard, and it's kind of a fun note to end on. Richard wants to know, what was the most surprising thing you learned during your research for this book that you didn't know before you started it?
I want to cheat and just say that, okay, let me, I want to cheat and say each of the chapters provided me with something, some. When you get the book, you'll walk through it and you'll see that. For me, there was something to learn at each moment of it. There wasn't one giant aha moment, because there were so many. Because I allowed myself to get close not just to the people who were experiencing the thing, but also to myself, to my own feelings, to what it meant, allow myself to get close to what it meant to carry this work and to carry the love I have, for example, my brother, which I write about, and the strains and stresses of caring for someone who's going in and out of jail and prison while moving in and out of jails and prisons to try to understand how other families deal with these things. And I wasn't surprised, but it was so pleasant to see the deep wells, the kind of wellspring of love that came from these families. It was really just quite beautiful, where people would figure out how to make the 5-hour trip, where people would figure out, where men on the inside who didn't get the 5-hour trip for many, many years would figure out how to be forgiving when they got home. You know, the moment of return. It wasn't surprising, but it was always touching when I'd be in that, when I follow men out of the muster room into the corridor where their families were waiting, and where a woman would hug her baby who she hasn't seen, her grandbaby. She hasn't seen him in 2 or 3 years, and he's much taller and he's much bigger. He's got a man's body now, and she just embraced him with her walker in between them. You know, these moments were powerful. But the other thing that was really interesting was the importance of values, and the importance of our ethical sensibility in how we think about these things and shaping how we do it. And the religious value that infuses the whole project, from the punishment to the presumption of redemption to the snatching of redemption away. That was not something I anticipated encountering, but I certainly saw it, and it was powerful, sometimes beautiful, sometimes incredibly violent. And I'm glad for it, because it's made me a better scholar, but it's made me a better person.
Thank you so much for that, Reuben. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you, Midtown Scholar, for hosting, and thank all of you for joining us tonight. This has been a real thrill to be in conversation with you, and I've learned so much from your book, but also just to get to talk to you about the work.
You're just fantastic. I'm just a fan, Elizabeth. I'm just a fan. Thank you for doing this. I very much appreciate it, and thank you for joining us tonight. I just very much appreciate you engaging this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Reuben. Thank you, Elizabeth, for this very important conversation. I always feel like it's a great place to stop when I'm like, let's just go like an hour more, maybe 2 hours more. Like, I feel like we could have gone all night here. So that's great. Reuben, congratulations on the book. It's titled Halfway Home. To our audience members out there, look in the chat room. You'll find a link that heads to our website, midtownscholar.com. Purchase your copy. We ship, and we're coordinating curbside pickup as well. I'd also be remiss if I did not plug Elizabeth's book one more time. America on Fire, coming out this May. Pre-order your signed copy. Again, look in the chat room. You'll find a link there that'll head to our website. Thank you to our audience, and thank you again, Reuben and Elizabeth, for joining us. Reuben, I want to give you the last word.
I think the takeaway from this work is that it's going to take hard work, but I think we have to work hard for the world that we want. If we let out every prisoner tomorrow, which I hope we do, they would enter a supervised society. You know, the question for us is that the society we want? I don't think we do. I think we want a society in which people belong, even people who've harmed us. And I'd like for us to think about how to bring that about.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.